It was the summer of 2015. 16-year-old high school student Karina Zalesova was preparing to start a new school year at her gymnasium. Everyone around her knew Karina as kind and responsible, and her parents would often say she was a miracle, an angel. On August 28th, Karina asked her parents if she could step out for a short while, promising to be back by 6 in the evening. But 6 o'clock came and went, and Karina never returned. Later that day, her parents would receive a devastating phone call. Karina also had a boyfriend, Mark Konkov, and I think by now you can already guess it was his name that would soon be tied to that horrifying news. To make sure we don't miss a single detail, let's start at the very beginning, because what comes next will shock you. Karina, just 16 years old, but already so remarkable. That's how everyone who knew her described her. She was born in 1999, the only child in her family, and lived in Novosibirsk, Russia, the largest city in Siberia. Kind, responsible, ambitious, and a straight-A student. Her friends often said she seemed much more mature and thoughtful than many of her peers. And at the same time, she was gentle and calm. She also taught herself Japanese. She bought books, studied on her own, and pushed herself further every day. Karina was fascinated by science, especially biology and chemistry. Those were the subjects she believed would lay the foundation for her future career because she dreamed of becoming a doctor. Her parents even transferred her to a specialized gymnasium so she could receive the best possible education and prepare for medical school. She first studied at a regular public school, school number 56. Later, she transferred to gymnasium number 23, which had a chemistry and biology focus. Just like Karina, Mark was born in 1999 and grew up in Novosibirsk. Karina and Mark first met at the birthday party of a mutual friend. She came with her best friend, and he was brought by one of his buddies. This was 2 years before the tragedy. According to Karina's grandmother, what struck her right away was how smart the boy seemed. He even claimed to have read all of Dostoevsky. If you don't know about Dostoevsky, he was a 19th century Russian novelist, famous for classics like Crime and Punishment, heavy, serious books that most teenagers would never touch. Karina's father later recalled that Mark always came across as well-read, intelligent, and confident in conversations, even when speaking with adults. Mark's family was extremely wealthy. His father, Igor, owned 11 companies in construction and metalworking. One of them, a company called Textol, reported revenues in 2015 of more than 600 million rubles, which, at the exchange rate back then, was nearly 10 million US dollars. His mother, Natalia, was a psychologist by profession. In total, Mark had 5 brothers and sisters. His uncle, Alexander, was a well-known political scientist working at an analytical center under the Russian government. In other words, Mark grew up in wealth and privilege, never lacking for anything. The Konkov family also owned a private cottage, and it was there that the crime would eventually take place. Karina was in love. What drew her in the most, as we mentioned earlier, was Mark's interest in Dostoevsky. Not only had he read the books, he actually understood them and could discuss every detail with her. At first, everything seemed fine. Karina was in love and believed in their future together. But the happiness didn't last long. Very soon, warning signs began to appear. Mark grew jealous, and in their messages he could threaten or insult her. At times, he even raised his hand against her. Karina confided to her friends that something was wrong with him, that his mind was clearly unstable. At school, classmates complained about his aggression and bullying, and among his friends he would sometimes suddenly start talking about suicide, or even confess that he wanted to kill someone. Back then, people brushed it all off as nothing more than teenage antics. Mark stopped sleeping, started hanging out with a questionable crowd, and said he wanted to experience a feeling like being on drugs. At the same time, Karina was focused on her studies, always moving forward, always striving to achieve more. In the summer of 2014, Mark suddenly stopped keeping in touch. He didn't answer her messages or calls. He just disappeared from her life without any explanation. Karina told people that maybe he was just busy and tried to stay strong, but it was obvious something was wrong. She seemed down, without her usual spark. Still, she kept up with her studies and continued doing well in school. But for Mark, it was the complete opposite. According to his friends, he became withdrawn, lost all interest in studying, spent all his time playing computer games, and stopped socializing with people altogether. Mark argued and clashed with teachers, often being openly rude. Classmates complained, and the parents of some girls were outraged. But many times, his behavior was swept under the rug. Adults preferred not to get involved, turning a blind eye to his misconduct, because Mark came from a powerful, well-connected family. By the summer of 2015, Karina and Mark still weren't speaking. A rumor began to spread that Karina had a new boyfriend. It's hard to say whether that was true or not, but Mark found out immediately, because even though they no longer talked, he was still watching her online. They might not have been in touch, but he kept track of her life. And that became the trigger. It hit him hard. He snapped, flying into a rage. According to people around him, he even smashed his phone against the wall when he heard about it. It seemed like even he didn't know what he wanted. One moment he missed her, the next he would cut off all contact. But what happened next is almost too terrifying to imagine. It was August 28th, 2015. That morning, Karina had orientation at her new gymnasium. She met her new classmates and received her very first assignments. Her father drove her to school and picked her up afterward. It was a joyful day, marking a new chapter and new opportunities in Karina's life. That evening, the family planned to have dinner together to celebrate. According to friends, not long before that day, their contact had resumed, on and off. Sometimes they would talk, and then suddenly they wouldn't. That same day was Mark's birthday. His parents were away on business, leaving him at home with his younger brother and a nanny. According to his own words, he felt lonely, and so he invited Karina over, playing on her sympathy, saying that no one had come to congratulate him. Mark had prepared the room in advance. He laid out a blanket, arranged candles, as if he were setting up a romantic evening. But he also brought a knife with him. Karina got a phone call, and just a minute later she asked her parents if she could step out for a little while. She promised she'd be back by 6 in the evening. By now, it's probably clear who was on the other end of that call. Her parents weren't worried about Karina because she was responsible and punctual. They assumed everything was fine. To be precise, Mark invited Karina to his family's cottage, where only his younger brother and the nanny were present. Karina arrived, and it was Mark himself who opened the door. She suspected nothing and walked in happily, thinking they were going to make up. It seemed she wanted to reconnect too. Mark led Karina upstairs, to his room. Everything was already prepared. A blanket laid out on the floor, candles placed all around. To her, it looked like an attempt to create a romantic atmosphere, as if he truly wanted to apologize and start fresh. But in reality, the knife was already waiting. He had taken it from the kitchen beforehand and hidden it, ready to use when the moment came. As soon as Karina stepped into the room, Mark pulled out the knife and began stabbing her. Experts later concluded that Karina fought back fiercely. On her hands, they found numerous cuts, defensive wounds she sustained while trying to protect herself. In total, Mark stabbed her 25 times. 12 of those wounds were to her neck. When he was finished, he simply sat on the bed and watched as Karina died. In addition to the stab wounds, her body also showed marks from blows with a metal statuette that he kept in his room. After Karina lost consciousness, Mark took her phone and tried to unlock it. It was locked. So he grabbed the hand of the girl he had just killed and pressed her finger against the sensor. It worked. The phone unlocked. He then began reading through her messages. To his surprise, he found nothing, because in reality, Karina didn't have any new boyfriend at all. She had simply been studying and living her life. After that, Mark called one of his friends and told him what he had done. At first, the friend didn't believe him. He thought Mark was joking. But then Mark sent him a photo from the scene. The friend immediately hung up and cut off all contact. Later, in court, he would confirm this story. Here's how the events unfolded next. After calling his friend and sending the photo, Mark acted strangely calm. At the time, his younger brother and the nanny were in the house, but they didn't hear or notice anything. The whole thing had happened in silence. By evening, when Karina still hadn't returned home at the promised time, her parents began to worry. They called her friends and acquaintances. Her father even went to the bus stop to wait for her, but Karina never arrived. Meanwhile, later that night, Mark's parents returned home. When they entered his room, they were met with a horrifying sight. Karina's body was lying on the floor. Mark was next to her and, according to witnesses, was pretending to be unconscious. His father tried resuscitating him with mouth-to-mouth and brought him back to consciousness. That's when Mark uttered a chilling phrase, "Why did you save me? I didn't want this." An ambulance was called immediately, but it was far too late. Karina had been dead for hours before the medics arrived. Karina's parents were told that their daughter had been found dead. For them, it was an unbearable shock. Just a few hours earlier, they had been expecting her for dinner, and now they were hearing the worst possible news. Mark was arrested right there in the house, but instead of being placed in pretrial detention, he was put under house arrest. The public quickly became convinced that this decision had been influenced by the Konkov family's wealth and powerful connections. Novosibirsk erupted with outrage. The news spread instantly. On the internet, especially on VKontakte, a Russian social network similar to Facebook, posts multiplied one after another. People could not believe that after such a brutal murder, the accused was sent to house arrest, living comfortably under the watch of his parents and a nanny. Almost immediately, an online petition appeared demanding the cancellation of his house arrest. It gathered more than 130,000 signatures. Karina's parents were in shock. Their daughter's killer was sitting comfortably at home, facing no real punishment. The public was discussing it everywhere, on social media, in the streets, at rallies. People turned to the media demanding justice. Only after a storm of criticism and public outrage, when the case gained massive attention and was covered by every major media outlet, did the authorities finally give in. 2 weeks after the murder, the decision on house arrest was overturned. Mark Konkov was transferred to a detention center where he should have been from the very beginning. He was assigned multiple psychiatric evaluations. The first one turned out to be inconclusive. The second and third were conducted in Moscow at the famous Serbsky Institute. There, specialists determined that Mark had schizotypal personality disorder and a strong tendency towards sadism. He was declared partially sane, meaning he understood what he was doing, but his psyche showed clear abnormalities. At first, the case was filed under the general charge of murder, but it was later reclassified as murder with special cruelty, Article 105, Part 2, Section D of the Russian Criminal Code. In early 2016, Karina's parents refused to give up. They wrote appeals, went to the media, and pushed for a meeting with the country's leadership. On March 3, 2016, they personally met with Alexander Bastrikin, the head of Russia's investigative committee. At the meeting, they described all the violations that had taken place during the investigation, the slowness of the process, the initial soft measure of house arrest, and the pressure coming from the Konkov family. After the conversation, Bastrikin publicly criticized the Novosibirsk investigators and ordered the regional office to correct their mistakes. This meeting became a turning point. After it, the case began to move forward more quickly, the investigation was completed, and it was finally sent to trial. The trial began in the summer of 2016 at the Pervomaisky District Court in Novosibirsk. The hearings were held behind closed doors because Mark was still a minor. But despite the closed doors, everyone in the city seemed to know what was happening inside. Karina's parents attended every single session. For them, it was torture, but they wanted justice. Mark's parents, on the other hand, tried to present everything as a tragic accident and insisted that their son was mentally ill. During the trial, the nanny, Mark's friends, doctors, and police officers all testified. Mark himself behaved coldly, showing little emotion. He admitted to killing Karina but claimed that some of the blows were delivered to speed up her death. There was no sign of real remorse. On October 31, 2016, the court delivered its verdict. Mark Konkoff was found guilty of murder with special cruelty and sentenced to 9 years in prison, the maximum sentence possible for a minor under Russian law. He was also ordered to undergo compulsory psychiatric treatment. In addition, his parents were required to pay 2 million rubles in moral damages, plus around 300,000 rubles for funeral costs. But for the public, the verdict was a shock. 9 years for such a brutal murder? Once again, people were saying that the law was far too lenient toward teenagers and that wealthy families always found ways to get around justice. Mark's lawyer was a whole separate chapter in this story. He was defended by Irina Noshrina, and the defense strategy she chose shocked and disgusted many. She claimed that the murder wasn't cruel. According to her, Mark allegedly acted out of mercy, saying he delivered so many blows so that Karina would suffer less. Even worse, during the trial, she suggested that Karina herself had supposedly asked him to do it. Imagine this. In a courtroom where Karina's grieving parents were sitting, the lawyer claimed their daughter had wanted to die, and Mark had simply helped her. But all the evidence showed the opposite. Karina's hands bore numerous defensive wounds. She had fought desperately until the very end. These arguments outraged not only Karina's family but also the public. In the eyes of many, it looked like a cruel mockery of her memory. After the verdict, the court ordered Mark's family to pay compensation to Karina's parents, 2 million rubles for moral damages and about 300,000 for funeral expenses. But as it later turned out, no one in Mark's family intended to pay that money voluntarily. Mark's parents claimed they had no way to pay, despite owning a luxury cottage worth tens of millions and running businesses with multi-million turnovers. And when Mark turned 18 in 2017, the court simply transferred the debt on to him. But as you can imagine, he had no intention of paying. In fact, in prison he refused to work, even though he had the opportunity to take a job in the furniture workshop or repair shop. For Karina's parents, this felt like a slap in the face. Not only did he show no remorse, but he also made no attempt whatsoever to offer even the smallest compensation. In prison, Mark did not behave like someone who realized the weight of his crime, but like a hardened thug. He constantly broke the rules, insulting staff, refusing to work, getting into conflicts with guards and other inmates. In just the first few years, he racked up dozens of disciplinary violations, and by the time of his release, the number had climbed to nearly 100. In 2017, he even attempted suicide, but the attempt failed. After that, he was transferred to a stricter regime. And in 2021, when his violations became too many, he was placed under a cell-type regime, essentially prison within a prison, with minimal freedom and complete isolation. Because of this, he automatically lost the right to early parole, even though, formally, he could have applied as early as 2020. After that, Mark continued serving his sentence until the very end. On December 8, 2023, 8 years and 3 months after the murder of Karina Zalesova, he was released. And it's important to understand, he wasn't released because he had changed or because he had repented or because he tried in any way to make amends. He was released simply because he had done his time. Moreover, under Russian law, each day spent in pre-trial detention counted as 1.5 days in prison. That's why he was freed before completing the full 9 years. By that point, he had accumulated nearly 100 violations in prison. He had never paid a single ruble of compensation to Karina's family, refused to work while incarcerated, and psychiatrists still kept him registered as a dangerous individual with schizotypal disorder and a tendency towards self-harm. And yet, formally, the law was followed, and Mark was released. Even more shocking, he returned to Novosibirsk, the very city where Karina's parents still live, where the murder took place, and where people still remember the case vividly. When it became known that Mark Konkov had been released, Novosibirsk once again erupted with anger. On social media, people immediately wrote, "A maniac is free." And who will take responsibility if he does it again? Karina's mother, Yulia Zalesova, spoke briefly but firmly. He never faced real punishment. He hasn't paid a single ruble. He never apologized. We read the doctor's reports. He is dangerous. He's a maniac, only now he's free. Karina's family considered turning to the European Court of Human Rights, but they no longer had the strength. Over the years, they had endured too much. The death of their daughter, the investigation, the trial, years of helplessness and waiting. Mark's father, on the other hand, tried to defend his son. He claimed that the media had blown the situation out of proportion and that the facts were distorted. But this only fueled even greater outrage in society. This story is yet another reminder of how unfair the system can be. If it weren't for the media and the millions of people who brought attention to Karina's murder, the case would likely have been swept under the rug. Honestly, 8 years and 3 months is nothing compared to a life stolen. My heart breaks for Karina's parents, and for Karina herself. She dreamed of becoming a doctor and helping people, but her life was cut short in the cruelest way. As for Mark, his actions prove he doesn't care. The punishment didn't change him. It's safe to say he hasn't reformed, because someone who had truly changed would at least try to pay compensation to the victim's family. What do you think about this case? Leave a comment and subscribe for more.